There's always a workaround.
Thanks for the suggestion. Wow, there are so many people from so many different aspects of Richard Bohr's life in different periods, and people have come from far away and close in terms of relationships. And so I'm going to ask the heavy bellies notwithstanding, if you are attached to the Chang or the Bohr clans, to kindly stand and take a bow.
I'm already standing. Raise a hand.
Thank you very much. Some of us, like I, are from pretty much the same zip code, so it's not as much. Are people hearing me? This is why. Aha. We are restored.
Can't move.
Thank you so much, Gail, for the honor of doing this. My name is Fred de Sam Lazaro, for those who may not know me. I work for the PBS network, and I have to manage expectations here. We are going to hear from some of Richard's closest friends from different parts of his life. Momentarily, I will come back at the end of this. I work for PBS, as I said, and we have complexes about that. There were a few years ago I was in Indonesia, and we usually hire people when we go to these countries to help make our arrangements. And the fellow we hired kept introducing me and my team to everybody as a team from CBS News. And by about the third time this happened, I pulled him aside and I said, "Look here, it's PBS, not CBS." And he said, "I knew it was something BS." So you have been warned. I'm going to turn this over first to Jon Gutzmann, who is probably someone who met Richard soon after he came to Minnesota. And I'll turn it right over to you, Jon, to pick up the story from there.
Thank you very much, Fred. I'm truly honored to be part of this incredible celebration. Happy birthday, Richard. Happy 80th. For the past 36 years, I was the executive director of the St. Paul Public Housing Agency, and I'm going to take you back 40 years ago, when Richard was the president of the Midwest China Center. And in 1984, I had the pleasure of meeting Richard. He was 39. And he appointed me to the board of the Midwest China Center. The Midwest China Center was established in 1975. Nixon opened China in 72. This was the first regional organization that tried to connect people and business and culture and religion with China. There was a bridge between the emerging Chinese interest in America and vice versa. And one of Richard's main goals was to get the early delegations of Chinese visitors to, yes, they were going to San Francisco and New York, but he said, hey, there's something in the middle. And Richard was so convincing to get delegations after delegations to come to Minnesota and stay with us in our homes and rough it. In 1985, we were fortunate to be invited to go to China, partially in thanks for all of the Chinese dignitaries Richard had put up in St. Paul. And we were invited to be guests of the Chinese government. And I was fortunate to get to go to that trip. We were invited by 3 provincial governors, governors of Shaanxi, Hunan, and Guangzhou provinces. And at that time, 1985, there were very few Americans in China and very few formal delegations. Not only were we the guests of the Chinese government for 2 weeks, meaning they paid, but Richard, being the persuasive guy he is, got Northwest Airlines to pay for our flight. Wow. And I happen to have the brochure from 1985 trip. And at the end of my presentation, I've made several copies. Don't come until the presentation's over, but I'd love to share them with you. 2 quick things about that trip. When we went to Changsha, Hunan, Richard had the idea of creating the sister city relationship with St. Paul. It was Richard's idea. We were on the walk. He saw that river, said, we have a river like that back in St. Paul. Being the diligent back person man, Richard got all the paperwork signed by then St. Paul George Latimer and did all the other corresponding with China, and that sister city relationship is here today. The second thing I remember, I have a lot of stories from that trip, Richard, but you know I can't tell them all. The second thing I remember about that trip is Richard's scholarly self. We were at Hunan University, and Richard gave a lecture to perhaps 500 people. And he spoke about his research, and many of you know his research and his books, the Taiping Rebellion. And Richard spoke in Mandarin to 500 people about his academic work. I was incredibly impressed. I want to end by saying Richard is truly a loving husband and father and a gentleman, and we know he's a scholar, but he's a visionary. And he saw back then the importance of the relationship with China. And he's my friend and lifetime mentor. Thank you, Richard. Happy birthday.
Thanks so much, John. We'll go next to one of scores of young people that Richard mentored, and it's to Kevin Clancy from the CSBSJU corner of the banquet hall. Kevin Clancy.
Thank you, Fred. And wow, is it an honor to be speaking here this evening. My name is Kevin Clancy, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Experiential Learning at St. Ben's and St. John's. But I got to this role because of Richard. And I need to start off with when I first met Richard, which was in a Chinese history course. And admittedly, it wasn't an interest in Chinese history that necessarily motivated me to take this course, but it was more motivation of I needed 4 history credits in order to graduate from St. Ben's, St. John's. And so I thought this would be a way to do it. And so I took this class, and what surprised me was that it was one of the best courses I took during my time at St. Ben's and St. John's. And it was one of the best courses partially because of Richard's deep history and understanding of China. The Taiping Rebellion was mentioned, and so we went there. But at the same time, Richard also created a community of learners and encouraged the students to grapple with the history and ask, what does that mean for them? And so because of this experience, I decided to take another course and added an Asian Studies minor to my degree. And one of the threads that ran through all of the courses and Asian Studies was that in all of these situations, Richard continued to create this community of learners and ask people to come together to think about how their own experience and their own histories connect with the histories that he was teaching. And it wasn't uncommon that there were students, of course, from Minnesota and the greater Midwest, but we also had international students from China and Japan who felt like they had a welcome voice in Richard's courses and were able to join the conversation. The other thread that connected the courses and the Asian Studies program was experiential learning. And Richard wanted to be sure that students took their learning outside of the classroom and were able to see what was happening outside of the classroom, whether that meant joining an Asian club or creating an Asia club or going on study abroad. In all of these cases, Richard was very interested in making sure that learning was happening outside of the classroom. And I think it's important to note that while I accidentally fell into the Asian Studies program, due to Richard's vision and belief in Asian studies, it grew into quite a large program to the point that subsequent students were to come to St. Ben's and St. John's because of the Asian Studies program. And so when you talk about vision, it's certainly something that we experienced too at St. Ben's and St. John's. And in the middle of central Minnesota, there's this large dynamic program. And if the story ended there, it would already be a good story about a mentor and a professor who inspired students and created this large, impressive program in Minnesota. But the story doesn't end there, because Richard was also very concerned that the learning didn't end at the end of the 4 years of college, but that it continued. And he also inspired many of us to go and to teach in Japan or teach in China. And so because of Richard's encouragement, I went with a number of students from St. Ben's and St. John's, as well as Father Bohr, to teach English in China through the Maryknoll program. And Richard continued to stay in touch with us, and so that when we would come back to the US, he would invite us to his classes to tell students what we had learned in China, or he would take us to the Peking Garden, another location at that time, out to lunch, to learn. And this was a scholar of the Taiping Rebellion who was interested to hear from us and what our experience was in China. And so Richard continued to keep that connection. The other thing that I had the great pleasure of working with Richard on was we created a short-term study tour in southern China, where in St. Ben, St. John, students would go to China and see China through the lens of the Pearl River Delta. And so Richard even served as the faculty director one year and flew over and got on a rickety bus with 15 students in Guangzhou and went down the coast to Guangdong to only get on a rickety boat to go across from the Zhanjiang Peninsula to Hainan, because he believed in experiential learning so much that he himself lived that learning too. And I think Richard's impact on students was evidenced by the fact that about 10 years ago now, a group of students rented a space similar to this to have a retirement celebration for Richard with some of the students. And there were dozens of students there. And while I have the honor of speaking here tonight, my story isn't unique. Because as you would go through this group of students, you would hear time and time again, not only what a great professor Richard was to them, but what an amazing mentor he continued to be even after they left St. Ben's and St. John's. And so when I think back to that original Chinese history class, we of course learned about Chinese dynasties. And one of the dynasties was the Tang Dynasty, which is widely considered to be the height of the Chinese golden era of culture and art. And I'd like to suggest to all of you here this evening that there is a Boer dynasty that occurred at St. Ben's and St. John's, which was truly the height of learning and culture through the Asian studies at St. Ben's and St. John's. And for those of us who are lucky enough to be part and to be connected to that Boer dynasty, as dynasties do, Richard's impact has continued to influence his generations of students who hopefully in their own humble and unique ways have tried to connect to the larger world and tried to build bridges outside of the space that they're in. And so if you would, I'm wondering if you could grab what glass is in front of you, and I'd like to raise a toast to the first 80 years of the Boer dynasty and many more years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. To Margaret Wong, we'll talk about community engagement. And Margaret is a stalwart when it comes to community engagement. She's done so much. And we'll go to you next, Margaret, to talk about your friendship with Richard.
Thank you. Richard, I didn't know that you are... No, I can't walk too far. Okay. I didn't know that you're 80 until I got your invitation.
Okay.
Because I always thought you were much older than I. And today you find out that I am truly much older than you. Why did I think you were so much older than I 40-some years ago? Because we all looked young then, right? 40 years ago. But because he was this tall, dark, and handsome Caucasian who was introduced to the group I was with as Dr. Richard Bohr, okay, PhD in Chinese history from Harvard. My God! After that, I didn't even dare go close to him. I immediately became ashamed and embarrassed because he knows so much more about my country, my motherland, and my country than I ever will by the time I met him. But instead of feeling sorry for myself, I saw an opportunity because I was forced by my headmaster to teach Chinese. And I really didn't know anything about it because I left China when I was in the 3rd grade. But the headmaster wouldn't let me quit. He said, you are Chinese, and if you're Chinese, you can teach French this well, then you ought to be teaching Chinese. Nixon has already opened the door to America, and it's time for you to teach Chinese instead of French. So I taught, I was lucky enough, I had my father with me, living at my home, so every night I sat up with him and his teaching me. And so I could teach the next day. But when I met Richard, I saw the opportunity to introduce history to my language teaching. This combination of language and history is exactly what American students need to learn, because just one or the other is too boring. So the headmaster hired you right away. And so we co-taught for some years before the colleges got hold of him. And Richard, we had the right timing. Our timing in our career was golden, you could say. Because when we started teaching, even though I didn't even know what I was doing, everybody wanted to learn. Americans were so curious, so excited, so enthusiastic about learning Chinese, about China, that we had a very easy time working those 40 years. And look at now. How long are we going to be in this slump? I certainly hope that it will be short. And what? Anyway, we hope our students that we have taught will continue our work into the future. And now I'll give my mic to another person. But before that, I just wanted to add to Kevin Clancy, you did not give Dr. Bohr your greatest gift that he gave you. Indirectly, he had Kevin meet the love of his life, the most beautiful child girl. Oh, Kaishan, do you know she's a descendant from Confucius? And she certainly has the wisdom. Thank you.
Sweet. It's my turn now. I first met Richard as a parent at Capitol Hill Magnet School. Jessica attended there, I think. She wasn't classmates with either of our children who attended, but that's where we met. And I remember knowing of Richard because he was a big shot. As John pointed out, he'd been brought here by Governor Perpich, I believe, to tell Minnesotans about trade globally in the China that was opening up. And I'm in the business where big shots want to talk to me because they want their stories on the news hour. But this was not Richard. I remember coming out of that meeting saying he was just interested in me and curious about me and so generous, and that really impressed me. And I found a lot of corroborating testimony in contacting some of his close friends who are unable to be here or who are unable to come here. And one of them is Bill Ma, Richard, who now lives in San Francisco. And he went to high school and was taught by you in Hong Kong. And he said this was a high school that was highly structured and strict, and they had teachers from New Zealand, Canada, France, and then there was the American, who was Richard Bohr, and he was the only one that was approachable. So I would go to him, and he would listen, and he would be encouraging. He always wanted us to be curious. Richard was the only teacher, Bill Ma said, who went from being teacher to teacher and friend, even came over to our house to visit with his then newlywed spouse, Gail. Bill Ma went on to study in California, where he still lives, and kept in touch or reconnected with the Boers, and was on hand or nearby when Father Bohr was born. So he knows Father Bohr when he knew Father Bohr when he was baby Bohr. I put the word out to the small group for what I call roast-worthy anecdotes that people might recall about Richard. And I called one of his oldest friends, a roommate at Harvard, and a fellow student in East Asian Studies, Charlie Litzinger. Not a damn thing. He said, I can't think of anything that will make Richard's face turn red. He was very social, he was very popular, always the center of attention, especially with the ladies. Very calm, grounded in all that he did, very organized. And, says Charlie Litzinger, he was a very witty person with a sense of humor beneath what we all know as his very priestly demeanor. I had a chance to see this from time to time, but notably when we were in China together, and he came along as an academic advisor on a reporting trip that I made with my team years ago. Now, contrary to my appearance, I actually have shallow roots in China. My parents and older siblings lived in Shanghai until 1950. And so Richard and I went into the cathedral in Shigaowei to just poke around, and we entered this huge church. It was just the two of us, and we think one, maybe two others in the church, if you include dead people as people in the church. That's because there was a coffin that was closed, a body presumably lying in repose until the service later on. And we were standing here in front of this coffin, in front of the altar, and there was this sound that kept echoing through the whole sanctuary. And it was a peculiar kind of yipping sound. Remember that, Richard? I do. And we had no idea where the sound was coming from because it was echoing all over. And here was Richard Bohr, Harvard Divinity School, in this very sober, somber environment, sacred environment. He turns to me and he whispers in my ear, Fred, I think he wants to be let out. Let me see. I picked up this habit from Richard. Many of you went out with Richard. He always carried these little cards in his pocket and jotted his notes down, so he never forgot. Richard and Charlie went different ways briefly because in the second year Richard departed East Asian Studies to go to the Divinity School at Harvard. And so Charlie has no recollection of the time when Richard met Gail, which was during this period. They reconnected after they'd met, and so I asked Charlie, I said, was he a changed man? Was he transformed in his new paired incarnation? And he said, he was. How could you not, this is a direct quote, how could you not be with a woman like that? We all know that Gail and Richard have been a real force in this community, in every community that they touch. Both of you have just mentored countless young people, and that began at home. You know, it's said that history does not repeat itself, but oftentimes it rhymes, and it has echoes. And you can just look at Jessica and Aaron. Jessica, wow. You know, when I look at how far and wide these two have traveled. Jessica, your service is something that commands our thanks, and we offer that to you. Can't go wrong with a woman like that, Charlie. Aaron, we were so honored to attend your ordination in Milwaukee. Some of us didn't realize that it takes 2 to 3 times the amount of time to get an SJ at the end of your name as it does an MD. You could have been 2 neurosurgeons by the time. I want to end with my own version, roast-worthy version of Richard. We were, as I said, in China. He was the expert on that long-ago trip. But I think he'd give himself less than an A grade on this desk. We had a colleague of mine, Kevin McAndrews, whose spouse had asked him to bring home to America a foo dog. And so it was Richard, Kevin, and I that went to this tchotchke store in Shanghai to find a foo dog. We had no idea what we were looking for, and the retail clerk had no idea what we were asking. Neither Kevin nor I spoke English. I spoke Chinese. Forgive me. Neither did the retail clerk speak English. But so we called our Chinese expert, and I don't know whether it was a Shanghainese dialect that was the language barrier, but Richard could not get across to this clerk what we were looking for. So he resorted, as one would, to barking. Literally. Yep, 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 yep. We came out of this shopping expedition empty-handed, but with this very funny anecdote. Richard, I think I probably speak for everyone in this room and everybody who knows you, including Charlie Litzinger, who has a few years on you. And he said, I've been trying to be like Richard. I've been trying to emulate Richard for 60 years, and I've failed miserably. You are, as Kevin McAndrews, who we lost a few years ago, would say, the world's nicest man. Thank you so much. And I'm going to encore what Kevin asked us to do, and to raise your glass, whatever is in it, for one more toast. One more toast. This extraordinary soul. Richard. Many happy return of the day.
Happy birthday!
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Richard. Happy birthday to you.
Chinese happy birthday. I cannot leave a guide on that one. Who's going to volunteer?
Yeah, blow them out, Greg. Go ahead. Good luck.
Excuse me. Pardon me.
Take it all the way.
You got it?
The other way.
You want me?
Turn it the other way. Turn the cake around.
Wait, oh, okay. I mean, I wanted to show it to him, but yes.
Did your table get one?
I'm just going to take a picture of it. And it's all the way.
You gonna blow it out, Papa?
I'll be right. Yeah. Good luck. Jesse, go. Jesse.
Jesse, I'm recording it.
Jesse, go with it. You take the picture. They're scared. Oh no, this one doesn't have. He's got his head. They're scared.
She's coming. Go join your family.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going. Give me a second. I'm fine. You don't want to wait here? Well, you can wait. Send us to Star Tribune.
One. And Gail, get back in the phone. And Gail, okay. 1, 2, 4. 4. Okay, everybody. Next year, same time, same place, 81. For the clown.